Hello, dear teacher. Hello, dear classmates. My name is Andrea Roballo, and this is my contribution to the forum. In today's video recording, I am going to talk about the differences, the main characteristics, and the subcategories of these grammatical devices, which are aspect, tense, and voice. So let's start with the first one, which is aspect. Regarding this category, it can be said that we are talking about the form of the verb, because when we produce a speech, when we write a coherent text, we have many forms of the verb. We have many ways to perform an idea. So for that reason, we have here some 4 subcategories, which are simple, progressive, perfect, and also a 4th one, which is perfect progressive aspect. So I am going to start with this first one, which is the simple grammatical aspect. In this subcategory, it can be said that we are talking about a verb that doesn't need the help of an auxiliary, or maybe to change the verb to an infinitive or gerund, because it is presented in its own form, but depending on the subject, like for example, the third person, we have to use to add the s at the end of the verb, which is the case of these 2 examples. Diana cooks the dinner, or the dog sleeps in the sofa. Both are the third person in present, so for that reason, we add the s. And we have here a regular verb and also an irregular verb, because we have both types of verbs. But when we're talking about past, within the simple aspect, we don't have to add, again, we don't have to add an auxiliary, or we don't have to use infinitives or gerunds in order to give coherence to the sentence. In this case, the verb only changed the form if it's an irregular verb, which is the case of the verb sleep. The past form, the simple past form, is slept. And regarding the regular verbs, we only have to add ed or d depending on the verb. And this is applied for all the subjects. It doesn't matter if it's a third person, second person, first person is singular or plural, etc. But on the other hand, on the progressive aspect, which is the second subcategory, it can be said that we need to use auxiliaries and the gerund form of the verb in order to present a coherent sentence, because in this case we are talking about a form in which the verb has a continuing form. That is because we are talking about ongoing actions or completed actions. So let's start with the ongoing actions. It doesn't matter if we are in the present tense, future tense, or past tense. In all the cases, the verb be will be needed, and also we will need to add ing to the main verb in order to express coherently. And on the other hand, completed actions, in this case, we're talking about temporariness or extended duration of an event. That is, I am not talking about something that is happening in that time. I am talking about that due to experience or quantity of time that a certain person or an object is doing something, it is happening in a better form. So for that reason, for example, Paul is performing better. I am talking that Paul is not doing that action in that moment. I am talking that the verb, the form of the verb, express that something is happening in a better way because that person has been doing that activity, the same activity, for determined time. Which is not the case on ongoing actions, because we are talking about something that is happening in the time. For example, Dana is eating pizza right now, form of the verb. the form of the verb explains that is happening. And for example, in the future, we can also use some future expressions in order to give more certain and specific information to the clause, like for example, tomorrow, and so on. And finally, we have the perfect aspect and the perfect progressive aspect. So I am going to start with the perfect aspect first. The perfect aspect contains the present perfect, which is the form of the verb that explains that something happened, started in the past and continues to the future. And we can also specify in that clause, in that sentence, we can specify the duration of the action and the starting point of the action. Like for example, I have studied English for 2 years. That is, for 2 years, this subject has been doing a determined activity, which is studying English. On the other hand, when we are talking about a starting point of the verb, we can use, for example, since I remember. Since is a word that helps us to understand that since that determined time, which is I remember, since that time, this person has been doing this activity. But with the perfect aspect, we can also explain or express different ideas, like for example, sequential order of actions, reporter speech, and if conditional. For example, in the sequential order of actions, it can be said that we can use this aspect in order to state the order of the actions, the sequence of the actions, like for example, when I arrived, Susan had already been dressed. That is, Susan first dressed herself, or she dressed herself. That is the first action. And second, the second action is when I arrived. This happened second. Also, when we're talking about the reported speech, we have, for example, my teacher asked if I had already sent the homework, so I answered the truth. In this case, I am talking about, we use this type of structure or this aspect when we want to express something that a third person or someone said. It doesn't matter the time, we are talking about the form. So for that reason, I use reported speech. Like for example, my teacher asked in the past that I had already sent the homework. So for that reason, when we have this type of situations, we use this type of aspect. And finally, if conditional sentences explain a condition, are an aspect that explain condition of the verb. For example, if you had studied, in this case, I have to use this structure to explain the condition that something would happen if this first action would have happened. For example, if you had studied for the exam, you would have had better grades. And finally, when we're talking about perfect progressive aspect, we're talking about, it's very similar to the perfect aspect, but in this case, we are saying that it is also used the auxiliary and the gerund form in the verb. The auxiliary have or has, depending on the subject, and of course, we have to add ing to the verb. For example, I have been studying English since I was a child, and we have the same information that we have here. Starting point, since I was a child, since this person is a child, has been doing this determined activity. So for that reason, an action that started in the past and continues to the present, but we are using the help of ing, which is the gerund form, and also an auxiliary, which is have been. So let's continue to the second part of the grammatical devices, which is tense. In this case, we are talking and we focus on the time of the verb. So for that reason, we can be talking about the past tense, the present tense, or the future tense. Let's start with the first one. Past. When we're talking about past, remember we're talking about the time. We focus about when something occurred. In this case, we're talking about an action that started and ended in the past. Like for example, we're talking about born, because this is something that happened in the past and ended in the past. We are talking about something that happened, and for that reason we use past expressions like, for example, yesterday, last month, etc. And also another important characteristic is that we have to recognize if we have a regular or irregular verb. If we're talking about regular verbs, we only have to add ed to the verb, but if we are talking about irregular verbs, we have to change the main form of the verb. So in this regard, we are talking about, we focus on the tense, that is the time when something occurred. We also can talk about present. When we're talking about present tense, we can express many types of ideas, like for example, habits, routines, facts, truth, and scheduled events. Like for example, when we're talking about habits, I always have breakfast with my mother. That is why we are using here an adverb of frequency in order to determine that habit. And for example, routines, I always take a shower at 6 a.m. To express a routine, we use the present, but also we use the adverb of frequency and of course, an expression of time. Facts, Anna loves her cat. It's a fact, so for that reason is a truth that happens for this subject. She loves her cat. Truth, whales live in the ocean. It's really similar to a fact, but in this case, we're talking about a general truth for everybody. Whales live in the ocean and this cannot be changed. And of course, scheduled events. In this case, we're talking about activities that have determined time to start. For example, the class starts at 7 p.m. So all these type of sentences with all these structures and information are presented within the present tense. And finally, the future. When we are talking about the future, we focus on activities or actions that have not already happened. For example, we can use in this case the auxiliary verb will, be going to, or modals. For example, I will study English some days. We are talking about something that will happen in the future, but we don't know when. We don't know exactly when this is going to happen. Or maybe be going to, which is an expression for the future in which we can express something for the future, but it is more, we have more information because it is not a promise that we are making or a plan that maybe will happen someday. This is something that it has been already scheduled. For example, she's going to travel to USA, but when we know when this is going to happen. For example, this is going to happen the next month, the next year, then the next week, etc. And also models that help us to talk about the future, but this is possibility. For example, Eden might stay in the night with his parents tomorrow, but might help us to explain that this is going to happen, of course, in the future, but he might stay or he might not stay. So we have here a possibility, or for is this a possibility to happen, or this is not a possibility to happen. Okay. So this is what I can say about tense that help us to be very clear about when an action is happening. And finally, the voice, this grammatical device, help us to understand the way we express a clause, an idea. It can be, when I am talking about the way, it can be an active voice, a middle voice, or a passive voice. So for that reason, this grammatical device answers to the questions, who does the action and who receives the action. So let's start with the active voice. In this case, we are focusing on the doer of the action. Like, for example, the cat chases the mouse. Ethan cooks the dinner. Danny will call me tomorrow. It is more important to be focused on the doer of the action instead of the receiver of the action. So this is one way to express this sentence, this idea. But we also have another way to express the same thing, the same idea. For example, the passive voice. The mouse was chased by the cat. In this case, we are more focused on the receiver instead of the doer of the action. So for that reason, when we are talking about passive voice, it can be said that we can mention the doer of the action if it's necessary. If it's not necessary, it doesn't matter. For example, I will be called tomorrow. It is not necessary to know who's gonna call me. So for that reason, I will be called tomorrow, because in this case, it is more important the action itself. And of course, when we want to mention that we have to give importance to the action, like for example, the receiver, the dinner is cooked, but at the same time, we also have here the person who is developing the action. But in this case, it is important to remind that it is more important the receiver than the doer of the action. And finally, the middle voice. In this case, we have a third way to express a clause, an idea. But in this case, it is called middle voice, or also quasi voice, because it uses the structures of the passive and the active voice. That is, the active voice because we have a doer of the action here, but at the same time it is a reflexive, because of the reflexive pronoun. We don't have a receiver, but the receiver is the same doer at the same time. For example, the pizza tastes delicious. We don't have someone else. The flowers smell good. We don't have someone else. This is our reflexive verb. The flowers is the doer and the receiver at the same time. And Andrea got up this morning. In this case, Andrea is the doer and also the receiver of the action at the same time. So this is a third way to explain, to express an idea, to express a clause, etc. So finally, a reflection about all this information is that it is important to be conscious about this structure, these grammatical devices, because these devices help us to understand when we are talking, okay, that is discourse, or when we are writing, that is the text, or the text form of language. that we have many structures, many forms to express. And for that reason, we have to be aware about these rules, about these devices in order to express coherently. So for that reason, this is happening because language is complex. It is not a robot. We have many structures in order to express an idea. And of course, understanding all this information help us to express coherently. And of course, if we want to teach this information at the same time, it will provide us the tools that we need to be very specific with information, or maybe to be specific with the tenses that we're explaining or that we are understanding at the same time. So this is my contribution for this forum. I hope this information is valuable for you. Thank you so much for your time and for your attention.